When people first met Chris Combs on 1,000 Pound Sisters, no one expected that his story would become one of the most talked about transformations in the entire franchise. He wasn't originally supposed to be one of the main characters. The show centered on Tammy and Amy Slayton, their health struggles, and their attempts to qualify for life-saving bariatric surgery. But as time passed, something unexpected started happening. Viewers began noticing Chris, not just as a background personality, but as someone with his own challenges, humor, fears, and goals. Slowly, he became someone fans looked forward to seeing every episode. In those early days, Chris wasn't trying to be famous. He wasn't focused on attention or social media. He was a regular family man from Kentucky, laughing, making jokes, working hard, and supporting his sisters the best he could. But underneath the humor and confidence, there was a deeper reality. Chris was struggling with his own health, and the weight he carried physically and emotionally was starting to take a toll. He always said he wanted to live long enough to watch his kids grow up, to hold his grandbabies, and to enjoy life without pain or constant worry. But back then, those dreams felt far away, almost impossible. His weight had climbed to over 450 pounds, and every step reminded him that time was slipping away faster than he wanted to admit. The smallest tasks left him out of breath. Walking up a flight of stairs felt like a workout. Sleeping without discomfort was almost a luxury. Still, when he was with family, he made everyone laugh. That was one thing the weight never took away, his sense of humor. But behind those laughs, there were fears he rarely voiced. He worried about having a heart attack. He worried about dying young the same way so many in his family did. He wondered if there would come a day when he wouldn't be able to walk, work, or function independently. The turning point didn't come suddenly. It came quietly, watching Tammy and Amy battle for their lives. He saw Amy fight through doubts and self-hate to finally get bariatric surgery. He saw Tammy nearly die from respiratory failure, her body collapsing from years of stress, food addiction, and neglect. Watching his sisters experience life-or-death consequences changed him. He couldn't ignore the truth anymore. One day during filming, he said something that stuck with fans. "If they can do this, then so can I. I want to live." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was honest, and that honesty opened a new chapter in his life. Once he officially started his own weight loss journey, things weren't easy. The emotional struggle was harder than the physical exercise. The cravings were strong. The doubts were louder. There were days he wanted to quit and days when he didn't believe he could change. But every small victory fueled him. Every pound lost meant another day he could stay alive. When Dr. Smith finally approved him for bariatric surgery, it felt like a victory bigger than numbers on a scale. It was a win against fear. A win against old habits. A win against hopelessness. After surgery, the changes began faster than even he expected. His body started shrinking, his mobility improved, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was gaining freedom, not losing something. He started doing things he never thought he could do, walking long distances, participating in activities, pushing himself beyond his comfort zone. He wanted to be proof, not just to viewers but to himself, that transformation was possible at any age, at any size, with enough determination. The only problem was something he didn't expect: the loose skin. It hung from his arms like heavy fabric. It rubbed against his clothing. It made moving painful and sometimes embarrassing. He joked about looking like a flying squirrel, but deep down he wished the outside of his body matched the strength he felt inside. So the next goal became clear: skin removal surgery. But before he could qualify, he had to lose even more weight. That meant more discipline, more sacrifices, and more pushing through physical and emotional discomfort. And he did, step by step, pound by pound. Then, the day finally came when he received approval for the surgery he had worked so hard for. Viewers watched him prepare with nervous excitement, worried, but determined. When he woke up after the operation, something inside him shifted permanently. He wasn't just someone trying to survive anymore, he was someone finally able to live. Now when fans see him smiling in photos with his grandkids or laughing alongside his siblings, it isn't just a happy moment for television, it's proof of resilience. Proof of strength. proof that he didn't give up on himself even when giving up seemed easier. Online, fans describe him as the heart of the show, a protector, and the voice of reason when arguments break out. He's the guy who tries to calm storms, support loved ones, and bring laughter to moments that feel too heavy. But now there's a new question rising among viewers, one that whispers across comments and fan forums. Is Chris still as healthy as he seems? Has the weight continued coming off? Or has life, pressure, stress, and time changed things again? Because sometimes the biggest battles happen after the cameras stop rolling. And as fans dig deeper, rumors and concerns are starting to grow, whispers that something may not be as perfect as it appears. After the excitement of his skin removal surgery settled and life slowly returned to normal, Chris found himself facing a new chapter, one that wasn't filled with the big medical milestones the world saw on screen. Instead, it was filled with daily decisions, small wins, setbacks, and the quiet reality of life after major weight loss. People often imagine that once the surgery is complete and the loose skin is gone, everything becomes easy. But for Chris, the truth was more complicated than that. The surgery didn't erase cravings. It didn't remove emotional habits built over decades. And it certainly didn't stop stress from showing up in his life like it always had. For a while, things felt perfect. He had more energy than ever. His confidence was growing. He laughed more, really laughed. And when he looked in the mirror, he finally recognized the person staring back. But then the real test began: maintenance. Weight loss requires motivation. Maintenance requires discipline, and that's a different kind of struggle. At first, everything seemed fine. He was busy with family gatherings, filming commitments, and new adventures. He tried new foods, new routines, and even new clothing styles. His family noticed the change not just in his size, but in his spirit. He felt lighter, not just physically, but emotionally. Still, there were moments during filming when he fell quiet, moments viewers didn't see on TV. Moments when he wondered, what now? What happens when the excitement fades? Adjusting to a healthier lifestyle meant learning a new relationship with food, activity, and self-worth. He didn't want to go backwards, not after everything he fought for. But old habits don't disappear, they wait. And life didn't pause just because he was improving himself. There were family challenges, drama, and tension, just like any family. Tammy's ongoing health scares, Amanda's fiery honesty, Amy's emotional journey through motherhood and divorce. All of it affected him, even when he tried not to show it. Being the strong one, the funny one, the peacekeeper, it came naturally, but it also weighed on him. Sometimes late at night, when everyone else was sleeping, he'd sit quietly in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and think about the years he spent ignoring his health. Not because he didn't care, but because life had always felt too busy, too overwhelming. He never wanted sympathy. He never wanted to be seen as weak. But there were days when discipline felt exhausting, when cravings hit harder than usual, and when the fear of slipping backward crept up like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Then something changed, something that reminded him why he started. One afternoon, while he was spending time with his grandkids, one of them climbed into his lap, wrapped their tiny arms around his neck, and whispered, "Papa, you're fast now." It was such a simple sentence, but it hit him harder than any doctor's warning ever had. Fast. Energetic. Present. Those weren't words that described him years ago. Not before the surgeries, the weight loss, the painful wake-up calls. But now? Now his grandkids saw him as someone strong, not someone sick, tired, or limited. That moment reminded him that his journey wasn't about surgeries or TV appearances. It was about living long enough to watch his family grow. So he recommitted, not because he had to, but because he genuinely wanted to. He started working on improving his endurance again. He took more walks. He explored foods that made him feel full of energy rather than regret. He found enjoyment in activities that years ago felt impossible: ziplining, hiking, exploring new places. And as his life evolved, so did his visibility. Fans noticed his transformation and started reaching out, not to comment on his size, but to ask for advice, encouragement, and hope. People told him, "You inspired me to lose my first 20 pounds. Because of you, I booked my consultation." You made me believe change is possible. Those kinds of messages humbled him. To the world, he was a reality star. But to many people struggling silently with weight, he was living proof that transformation wasn't just for the lucky few. His Instagram began filling with photos, not staged, filtered perfection, but real-life moments, fishing trips, family dinners, goofy selfies, and spontaneous adventures. Fans could see the glow, the strength, the pride. But with attention came something else, pressure. The expectation to stay perfect, to never regain weight, to always look motivated, disciplined, and strong. It was a heavy burden, not because he didn't want to stay healthy, but because the world expected consistency even though he was still human. Some days he woke up determined. Other days he woke up tired. But no matter how the day started, he reminded himself, I didn't fight this hard just to go backwards. Still, despite the progress and positivity, whispers from the audience had begun. Some viewers started asking, has Chris gained weight again? Is he struggling behind the scenes? Why does he look different than before? Rumors began circling. Fans speculated based on screenshots, angles, clothing, or short clips. And while some comments were supportive, others weren't kind. Chris didn't address it publicly, not yet. But privately, he noticed. He saw the threads, the assumptions, the judgments. And quietly, a question began growing. Was his journey truly stable, or was another chapter of struggle waiting just around the corner? Because even though his life looked happier, healthier, and fuller, something unseen was beginning to shift. Something fans wouldn't fully understand until later. And that silent shift is what would soon change everything. There was a calm before the storm, a quiet stretch of life where everything appeared normal on the outside, but underneath the surface, something was changing in Chris. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't dramatic the way television edits make things look. Real life rarely is. It started small, skipping a workout here, treating himself there, telling himself he deserved a break after everything he'd gone through. At first, it felt harmless, almost like a reward. After all, hadn't he earned a moment to breathe? But slowly, those moments turned into routines. His schedule shifted, his motivation wavered, and the sharp structure he once followed began to fade into comfort, habit, familiarity. It wasn't that he didn't care, it was that he finally felt safe, and with safety came a dangerous sense of relaxation. Meanwhile, filming continued. Cameras rolled, producers asked questions, and audiences watched with assumptions he could feel even when the comments weren't spoken aloud. Sometimes during confessionals, he'd glance at the playback monitor and catch a glimpse of himself from a different angle, a little fuller in the face, a little more weight around the midsection, and his chest would tighten. He'd smile through it, laugh, even make a joke before anyone else could. Humor had always been his armor. If he said it first, no one else could use it against him. But when the filming stopped and the microphones were removed, he could feel the shift, something he couldn't laugh away anymore. And as months passed, old patterns resurfaced, slow, subtle, familiar. Food wasn't just food. It was comfort during stress, celebration during good days, distraction during bad ones, and a reward when he felt overwhelmed. He didn't talk about it, not even to family. Everyone assumed he was doing great, staying strong, staying motivated. And that assumption made it harder to admit that things were unraveling. The turning point came one afternoon during a routine check-in appointment for the show. It wasn't supposed to be a big moment, just measurements, updates, a simple weigh-in. But as he stepped onto the scale, the numbers rose higher than expected, higher than he wanted, higher than he could pretend wasn't happening. Silence filled the room. Cameras paused, not cut, just hesitated, waiting for a reaction. Chris stared at the number, numb. Not shocked exactly, but hit with the reality he'd been avoiding. Well, he finally muttered with a forced laugh, looks like the scale missed me. The room laughed politely, but his heart didn't. Later, in the parking lot, sitting alone in the van, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Fear. Not of surgery, not of weight, but of losing everything he fought so hard for. Because weight loss isn't a straight line. It's a battle with memories, cravings, identity, and years of coping mechanisms that don't disappear just because the number on the scale does. That night, at home, he sat on the edge of his bed scrolling through old photos, before surgery, after surgery, milestones, episodes, moments where his smile looked full of pride, not performance. He remembered how heavy walking once felt, not just physically, but mentally. How every breath used to feel like effort. How doctors used to warn him gently, then urgently, then bluntly. He remembered the moment he decided he wanted to live, not exist, not survive, but live. And now, facing the possibility of slipping backward, that memory hurt. His wife noticed his silence. She didn't ask with pressure. She simply placed her hand over his and said softly, "You're not failing. You're learning." That single sentence broke something open inside him. Because she was right. Progress isn't perfection. The next morning, instead of avoiding the mirror, he faced it. Not to judge himself, but to acknowledge where he was. He took a slow breath and whispered, "We're not going back." And from that moment, he started rebuilding. Not with dramatic gestures or televised revelations, but with small, deliberate choices. He walked again, at first slowly, then longer. He meal prepped, not because the show expected it, but because he needed stability. He tracked his sleep, planned his days, and held himself accountable, not perfectly, but consistently. And just when things started to stabilize, life delivered another unexpected twist, one that wasn't about weight, food, or habits, but something deeper, quieter, and far more serious. Chris began experiencing strange symptoms, fatigue that didn't make sense, shortness of breath that felt different from anything tied to weight, and sudden sharp pains that would come and go without warning. At first, he brushed them off: stress, age, long days, long filming schedules. But one night, while sitting on the couch watching TV, a wave of dizziness hit him so hard he had to grab the armrest to stay upright. His vision blurred. His chest tightened. For a moment, he truly believed something was wrong, really wrong. His wife rushed to him, terrified, asking if she should call 911. The moment passed after a minute, but it left behind a fear that refused to fade. The next morning, he made a doctor's appointment. Not for the show, not for content, but for himself. Tests were ordered, blood work, scans, monitoring. Days passed, then weeks, with no clear answers. And during that time, the whispers from fans grew louder online. Something seems off with Chris. Why does he look tired lately? Has something happened? No one outside the family knew the truth. Not yet. Because before he faced the world, he needed answers. And when the results finally came in, everything in his world shifted. When the phone finally rang, Chris felt his stomach twist into knots. He stared at the caller ID, his doctor's office, before answering with a cautious, almost shaky, "Hello." The voice on the other end was calm but carried a weight that made his heart pound. The doctor explained that some of the results were concerning, particularly his heart function numbers and inflammatory markers. Something wasn't right and they needed more testing. For a moment, the world around him felt like it stopped moving. He wasn't thinking about the show, the weight loss, fans, or filming. He was thinking about his wife, his kids, his grandkids, and the terrifying possibility that his body might still be battling something unseen. That night, while the camera crews packed up and left, while social media continued speculating about his health from afar, Chris sat in silence on the porch. The sky above him was dark, full of stars he couldn't fully focus on. He replayed everything, every diet attempt, every surgery, every milestone, every relapse, wondering how much of it mattered if his body was failing anyway. But deep down, beneath the fear and confusion, something else sparked: fight. He'd been scared before. He'd been near the edge before. And every time, he'd climbed back up. Over the next few weeks, he underwent more detailed tests: echocardiograms, stress tests, scans, blood panels. Cameras followed some of it because that was the reality of his life now. His medical journey wasn't just personal, it was public. But some moments he didn't allow on camera: the quiet panic attacks in parking lots, the long drives home when he'd wipe tears from his eyes so his family wouldn't see, the late-night conversations with himself in the bathroom mirror whispering, "You're not done yet." His family noticed the change in his mood, though he tried to hide it with humor. Tammy would call him randomly and ask, "Are you okay?" in that protective big sister tone she rarely showed on camera. Amy checked on him even more, sending meals, texting reminders, offering support the way family does when they know something is wrong even without being told. And while Chris appreciated the love, part of him felt ashamed. He thought he had already won this battle. He thought the surgeries, the struggles, the triumphs were the turning point, not a checkpoint. Finally, the day came for the results meeting. Sitting in the small beige exam room, his leg bounced anxiously as the door opened. The doctor sat down, reviewing the chart carefully before speaking. The news was serious, but not hopeless. His body was showing signs of cardiovascular strain, not catastrophic, not irreversible, but serious enough that ignoring it was no longer an option. The doctor explained that rapid weight changes, past medical history, and years of stress had all contributed. The good news was that with treatment, monitoring, and lifestyle adjustments, he could prevent long-term damage. The bad news: one slip, one stretch of neglect, one ignored symptom could take him backward fast. The relief and fear hit him at the same time. His eyes burned, not because he was weak, but because he was human. On the ride home, as the highway blurred by and his wife rested her hand on top of his, the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was clarity. He wasn't being punished. He wasn't failing. This was another chapter in a long, messy, brave journey. And deep down, he knew something with absolute certainty. The world might see the weight loss, the surgeries, the before and after photos, but the real battle was internal, emotional, lifelong. Later, when cameras returned, fans noticed something different, not physically, but in his presence. He looked more grounded, more aware, more determined. He didn't frame this as a setback. Instead, on camera, he took a deep breath and said, "This journey ain't over. And maybe it never will be. But I'm still here. And I'm still fighting." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rehearsed. It was real. And for the first time in a long time, he believed himself. The next days felt longer and heavier than anyone expected, and even though everyone tried to stay positive, the atmosphere around the family shifted into something tense and unspoken, like everyone was waiting for someone to say the thing they were all afraid to voice. What if something was really wrong, and this wasn't just a temporary setback? Amy kept replaying every doctor's sentence in her head, trying to find comfort in words that didn't quite feel comforting, and every time the nurse walked in, her heart would jump because she didn't know if the news would be reassuring or another worry to add to the growing list. There were moments where the room felt normal, where they laughed at something silly her son did or remembered a joke one of the siblings had said, but the laughter faded quickly because the fear sat underneath everything like a shadow. Tammy called multiple times a day, and even though she tried to keep her voice calm, everyone could hear the panic she was trying to hide. At one point, she said, "Everything's gonna be fine," but her voice cracked just enough that Amy felt tears sting her eyes again. The hardest part was watching her child sleep, with machines softly beeping, wires taped carefully along his tiny arms, reminders that rest wasn't happening naturally, that help was needed for even the simplest body functions right now. Every mother expects to protect their kid, but hospitals have a way of making parents feel small, powerless, and terrified. Chris came to visit later that afternoon, and he didn't try to give a motivational speech or act overly cheerful. He just sat, quiet and solid, like an anchor in a storm. After a long silence, he finally said, "We've gotten through worse as a family. We don't break. We take the hit, stand back up, and fight harder." And even though the words were simple, something about the way he said them made Amy breathe a little deeper, like maybe she could handle the next hour and then the next after that. Meanwhile, online speculation continued growing, with fans commenting nonstop, some praying, some spreading rumors, and some asking questions that felt too invasive at a time like this. Chris told everyone to ignore it. The outside world could wait. What mattered was the boy in the hospital bed, the family sitting around him, and the hope that each new morning would bring better numbers, shorter machine alarms, and stronger signs of recovery. Still, the waiting was the hardest part. not knowing how long this chapter would last or how it would end, and every second felt like balancing between fear and faith. As the hours stretched into another long day, the hospital routine became painfully familiar, almost rhythmic, but never comfortable. Every sound, from the distant rolling of a medical cart to the soft echo of overhead announcements, seemed louder than before, like the world was reminding Amy she wasn't at home, she wasn't in control, and she wasn't waking up from this nightmare anytime soon. Nurses came in on schedule, checking monitors, adjusting medication, whispering to each other in coded medical language that felt impossible to understand but terrifying to interpret. Amy tried to read their faces every time they left the room, searching for relief, hope, or even a subtle clue that things were improving, but sometimes they walked out with expressions so neutral it made her stomach twist. The stress built layer by layer, like holding her breath for hours, and even though the doctors said there were signs of progress, it didn't erase the fear that lived under every thought. Her phone buzzed constantly, messages from family, fans, producers, and reporters, but she ignored almost all of them because nothing outside those hospital walls felt real anymore. The world didn't shrink, but her focus did. It was just her son, the monitors, the nurses, and the thought that she would do anything, absolutely anything, to hear him laugh again without machines beeping beside him. At one point, a nurse gently encouraged her to step outside, breathe fresh air, and eat something real, not vending machine snacks or cold coffee, but Amy refused. She couldn't bring herself to leave the room, even for a minute, because she kept imagining something happening while she was gone. A doctor walking in with news she needed to hear, her child waking up scared, or alarms going off. The fear of absence hurt more than exhaustion. Later that night, the rest of the family visited again, each person carrying a different kind of emotional weight: guilt, fear, anger, hope, and though no one said it aloud, there was this shared understanding that moments like this reminded them how fragile life really was. Chris tried to lighten the mood again with humor, saying something goofy about hospital food tasting like something shipped straight from the prehistoric era, and even though no one laughed loudly, a few tired smiles appeared, and sometimes that's all a family needs to keep going. Tammy stayed on FaceTime longer that night, her voice softer and more emotional than usual. She said she wished she could be there physically, but the hospital restrictions made it impossible. Still, she kept repeating, "He's strong, stronger than any of us give him credit for," and those words stuck with Amy like a quiet anchor. When the nurses dimmed the lights and the room finally settled into a calm silence, Amy sat beside the bed, holding her son's hand, whispering hopes into the darkness, promises about future birthdays, Christmas mornings, first days of school, and all the memories they hadn't made yet. She told him that the world was waiting for him, not because he was on TV or because strangers watched their journey, but because he was loved deeply and fiercely. And even though exhaustion sat heavy in her bones and fear lingered in every breath, she stayed awake longer than she should have, watching every rise and fall of his chest, praying quietly that tomorrow would bring fewer wires, fewer machines, and more signs of strength, because even the smallest improvement felt like a miracle in moments like this. The next morning arrived with a faint glow of sunlight filtering through the hospital blinds, soft and almost gentle compared to the storm of emotions that had filled the previous night, but it didn't bring any relief, only a heightened sense of anticipation and worry. Amy and Chris had been up most of the night, taking shifts to watch over the monitors, whispering to their son when he stirred, and holding his tiny hand as if sheer touch could anchor him in safety. Every beep, every movement, every slight shift of the 4 lines or pulse monitor became monumental in their minds. The smallest change could feel like progress or panic, and they had to constantly remind themselves not to overreact but never to ignore anything. Time moved in strange loops. Moments stretched for hours, and hours passed in what felt like minutes, while cameras filmed silently in the background, capturing only fragments of the emotional hurricane, unable to grasp the true weight of the worry that hung thick in the air. The nurses were attentive and professional, offering reassurance, but they also reminded Amy of the fragility of the situation. Each word they spoke carried a double edge, comfort and caution intertwined. Chris, who had always been the strong one, the humorist, the protector of his sisters, felt the gravity pressing down differently this time. He cracked jokes less frequently, smiled less readily, and instead sat with his head bowed in quiet contemplation, thinking of every choice that had led to this moment, every lapse that could have been prevented, and every ounce of energy he had left to give. Their phones buzzed incessantly, messages from friends, distant family, fans asking for updates, and even strangers sending prayers and words of encouragement. But neither Amy nor Chris had the mental space to engage fully. Their focus was absolute, watching the monitors, reading the subtle cues of their child's tiny body, interpreting the signs that could make the difference between hope and despair. And then, amid that tension, there were brief, surreal flashes of normalcy, a yawn, a sneeze, a small giggle that slipped out unexpectedly, and in those tiny moments, the room seemed to breathe along with them. These fragments reminded them of why they endured this grueling ordeal, why they had fought for every step, every pound, every breath. Later that afternoon, a doctor came in with measured calm, sharing cautious optimism but reiterating that recovery was fragile and full of unpredictable turns. Amy nodded repeatedly, trying to absorb both the relief and the warning, her thoughts oscillating between hope and fear in a dizzying rhythm. Chris, gripping her hand tightly, felt the tension release slightly but remained vigilant, knowing that any lapse in attention could undo hard-won progress. They both sat together, exhausted but unwavering, speaking in whispers about future plans, about birthdays yet to celebrate, about small vacations and family dinners, weaving visions of normalcy into the sterile hospital room. In these whispered moments, they found strength not just in themselves but in each other, a deep and unspoken bond that carried them through the darkest hours. Night fell again, heavy and slow, and as the monitors blinked steadily, Amy whispered promises to her son about the life waiting for him, a life full of laughter, family, and freedom from wires and machines, while Chris silently vowed that he would be the guardian of that life, the anchor, the one who ensured that every day they fought so hard to survive, to thrive, and to live would be real, meaningful, and full of love. The following days seemed to stretch endlessly, a relentless blur of appointments, monitor readings, and quiet moments filled with both hope and fear, and yet, amidst the sterile hum of hospital machinery, Amy began noticing subtle signs of change, tiny victories that felt monumental in the context of everything they had endured. The slight increase in her son's responsiveness, the faint color returning to his cheeks, the way he managed a brief stretch without the alarms immediately sounding, and even the soft flutter of a smile that seemed to break through the tension like sunlight piercing a heavy storm, each of these small triumphs stirring a complicated mix of relief, gratitude, and renewed vigilance in her heart. Chris stayed by her side constantly, sometimes pacing quietly when nerves got the better of him, sometimes sitting rigidly in the chair beside the bed with hands folded, eyes scanning every monitor, silently calculating every variable that could affect his child's recovery. They shared glances that didn't need words, communicating instead with tense nods and tiny squeezes of the hand, a silent partnership forged in a furnace of anxiety and love. The nurses and doctors were a constant presence, reminding them both of the progress, while cautioning that one misstep could unravel what little control they had over the situation, and the weight of responsibility pressed heavier than either had anticipated, reminding them that healing was not linear nor guaranteed, and that patience was as crucial as vigilance. At night, when the hallways quieted and the bright fluorescent lights dimmed to a softer glow, the two siblings would sit together beside the bed, whispering stories of normal days they yearned for, simple breakfasts with pancakes, playful arguments over silly things, walks through the park, and family movie nights where everyone could laugh without machines in the background, and in those whispered plans, they found a fragile sense of hope that kept them anchored to a future that seemed almost surreal in its possibility. Fans, of course, continued to send messages and prayers online, unaware of the intricate details of hospital life, the tension that lurked behind every update, or the emotional labor of staying composed in front of cameras while grappling with fear so raw it left both Amy and Chris sleepless, hearts pounding in tandem with every beep of the monitors. They learned to celebrate every tiny milestone, whether it was a slightly stronger heartbeat, a brief moment of alertness, or a minor improvement in lab results, because in a situation like this, small victories were not small, they were everything. Yet, beneath the cautious optimism, there remained a shadow of doubt, a gnawing question that neither could silence completely. What if the progress they were seeing now was temporary? What if the setbacks that had been narrowly avoided would return with greater force? What if their child's resilience was not enough to carry him through the next challenge? And still, despite the exhaustion, the uncertainty, and the ever-present tension, they refused to give in to despair. They leaned on each other, on their faith, on the unwavering hope that had carried them through past struggles, and in the quiet, long stretches of the night, Chris would murmur to Amy, "We've come this far, sis. We can't stop now. We fight, we hold on, and we keep going." And though simple, those words became a lifeline, a mantra, and a reminder that the fight for their child's life, though grueling and unending, was worth every sleepless hour, every tear, every pang of fear, because love demanded nothing less. By the time the 9th day rolled around, the family had settled into a strange rhythm, a combination of constant vigilance, fleeting moments of relief, and an almost tangible tension that never seemed to fully dissipate. And yet, in this fragile routine, Amy and Chris found themselves noticing patterns that gave them a cautious sense of hope. The small, incremental improvements were becoming more consistent. His breathing slightly steadier, the color in his cheeks a bit stronger, his little fingers curling and uncurling with more purpose. And though these changes could have been dismissed as minor by anyone not living in the room, to them they were monumental, proof that their child's resilience was shining through the exhaustion and fear that had gripped everyone since the beginning. The siblings leaned on each other more than ever, Chris taking responsibility for logistical decisions, coordinating with doctors and nurses, handling phone calls, and managing their presence on social media for updates, while Amy focused on the emotional side, maintaining a sense of hope, keeping the small rituals that brought comfort, whispering stories, singing soft lullabies, and gently stroking her child's hair to remind him that he was loved, safe, and cherished beyond measure. Every day was punctuated by tests, brief visits from specialists, and check-ins that reminded them just how delicate the situation remained. And yet, with each passing hour, their confidence grew, not in the sense of certainty, but in the subtle, undeniable proof that progress was happening, slow and cautious though it was. Nights remained the hardest, hours stretching endlessly as the monitors beeped and the halls outside were quiet, every small sound amplified by fear and anticipation. But in those long hours, Chris and Amy talked in hushed tones, sharing memories, planning for a future they were desperate to reach, discussing the trips they still hoped to take, the birthdays, holidays, and simple joys that had been put on hold. And even while exhaustion weighed heavy, the conversations became a lifeline, a way to anchor themselves amid uncertainty, a testament to the strength they had found in one another. Outside the room, the world continued, oblivious to the intensity within. Fans speculated, posted updates, and offered prayers without ever grasping the emotional toll that each moment demanded. But the family barely noticed because their focus was singular, ensuring the smallest victories were not overlooked, celebrating each breath, each response, each sign of strength, because these were the true markers of survival, and nothing else mattered. Chris began reflecting more deeply on his own journey, on the years of weight struggles, surgeries, public scrutiny, and personal transformations, and realized, with a quiet, almost painful clarity, that no amount of physical change could have prepared him for the emotional endurance required now, that even with health restored and weight lost, the fragility of life remained, and the fight for another human being, especially one so small and vulnerable, demanded a resilience and courage unlike anything he had faced before. Yet, amidst the fear, the uncertainty, and the relentless vigilance, there were sparks of light, tiny, powerful reminders that life, even in its most fragile state, could still bring joy. A coo, a laugh, a squeeze of his hand, a fleeting smile that melted away hours of worry, and in these moments, Chris and Amy felt the weight of exhaustion lift ever so slightly, replaced by a fierce determination to hold on to hope, to fight, and to believe that tomorrow, and the days after, could be brighter, fuller, and more alive, even if the path remained steep, uncertain, and filled with challenges they had yet to face. The final stretch of this journey felt both endless and fleeting at the same time, as though each day held an eternity of anxiety, fear, and vigilance, yet also contained the fragile promise of hope that made every moment worth enduring. And as the family navigated this delicate balance, Amy and Chris became attuned to subtleties they might once have overlooked: the slight change in the color of a fingertip, a deeper breath, the way a tiny hand wrapped around a finger with more intent than before, all of which became signals that their child was growing stronger in ways that weren't always visible to outsiders, but resonated deeply with those who had been by his side every single second. The hospital room, once intimidating and sterile, began to feel like a place of transformation, not just for their child but for themselves. Every challenge, every sleepless night, every wave of fear and relief layered together to forge a new kind of resilience that none of them had anticipated, one that went beyond physical strength and into the very core of their emotional being. Friends, family, and even fans sent messages of encouragement, prayers, and virtual hugs, which, while sometimes overwhelming, reminded them that the world could be both a source of pressure and support. And in those rare, quiet moments, Amy and Chris allowed themselves to absorb the love and hope that people sent, knowing that it strengthened their resolve even when exhaustion threatened to overtake them. As the hours turned into days, and days slowly into weeks, small milestones began to accumulate into something tangible. A steady heartbeat, improved lab results, moments of alertness that stretched longer than before, and the rare, radiant smile that lit up the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Each victory celebrated quietly but fiercely, a reminder that progress, though painstakingly slow, was indeed happening. Chris found himself reflecting not only on his own journey, the battles with weight, the surgeries, the public scrutiny, the personal transformation, but also on the profound lessons this experience had taught him about patience, endurance, and the true meaning of family, realizing that love and commitment were measured not in comfort or ease, but in the willingness to stand firm through fear, uncertainty, and the weight of responsibility that sometimes felt too heavy to bear. Amy, too, felt a profound shift within herself. The anxieties that had once seemed insurmountable now felt like challenges to be met with determination, the guilt and doubt softened by the recognition of her own resilience and a deeper understanding that healing, both hers and her family's, was a gradual process marked by tears, triumphs, setbacks, and victories, all interwoven into a tapestry that would forever define this period of their lives. As the final moments of filming for this chapter of their story approached, the family gathered close, whispering reassurances, sharing soft laughter that felt like a balm after weeks of tension, and promising each other that no matter what lay ahead, they would face it together, stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before. In the quiet aftermath, when monitors hummed steadily and the room was finally calm, Amy held her child close, Chris by her side, and together they allowed themselves a rare moment of relief, feeling the weight of months lift slightly as they embraced not only the victory of progress, but the unbreakable bond that had carried them through every trial, every fear, every sleepless night. And as sunlight poured gently through the windows, illuminating the room with warmth and hope, the siblings knew that while life would continue to present challenges, nothing could diminish the strength, love, and resilience that had been forged in these days of struggle, and for the first time in a long time, they allowed themselves to breathe fully, to imagine the future with cautious optimism, and to step forward together, hearts intertwined, ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing they had survived the storm and discovered within themselves a courage deeper than they had ever known, a love more profound than words could capture, and a hope that, despite everything, shone brighter than any fear could ever dim. Even as the immediate crisis seemed to ease, the following days brought a new kind of challenge, one less urgent but no less demanding, navigating the delicate balance between vigilance and normalcy, between allowing moments of joy and maintaining the routines that ensured safety and recovery. And Amy found herself confronting an unexpected wave of emotions, from lingering anxiety to a quiet, stubborn sense of triumph that mixed relief with exhaustion in a way that left her both elated and drained. Chris, ever the protector, watched her carefully, noting the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted to monitors even when they didn't beep, and he silently reminded himself that healing wasn't only about the physical signs of progress, it was about supporting each other through the emotional turbulence that came with surviving such an intense ordeal. They started to create small rituals, almost like lifelines: breakfast at the same time every morning, a shared cup of coffee before the world fully woke, a few minutes of laughter reading fan messages, whispered plans for future family outings, and even tiny celebratory gestures for each new milestone, whether it was a slight improvement in vitals or a successful day without complications. Though the outside world was buzzing with speculation, comments, and endless questions, inside the hospital walls, Amy and Chris focused on their own rhythm, measuring success in breaths, smiles, and small signs of comfort. At night, they would sit together, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking in hushed tones, imagining the life that awaited them outside the machines, the joy of simple freedoms long taken for granted, like walking through a park, feeling the sunlight on their faces, and sharing ordinary moments with their child that had once seemed impossible. There were setbacks too, brief alarms that made their hearts pound, sudden changes that required instant attention, and moments of self-doubt that crept in like shadows. But each time, they reminded themselves that resilience wasn't defined by perfection, but by persistence, by showing up over and over again, by refusing to surrender to fear no matter how heavy it felt. The family, extended by Tammy, Amy's other siblings, and even Chris's steadfast support, formed a tight-knit network that carried them through, a living proof of shared strength and love that could weather uncertainty. Slowly, incrementally, the room transformed from a place of anxiety and tension into a space of hope and subtle celebration, where laughter began to punctuate the air more frequently, where smiles lingered longer, and where the presence of family, combined with the steady improvement of their child, created a fragile but growing sense of possibility. And in those quiet, reflective moments, as Amy held her son close and Chris's hand rested on her shoulder, they both understood a profound truth. Survival was not a singular act, but a daily, relentless commitment, an emotional and physical journey that demanded courage, patience, and unwavering love, and that even amidst fear and uncertainty, there was room for hope, for planning, for dreaming, and for the slowly dawning realization that life, despite its trials, could still feel full, bright, and undeniably precious. The days that followed brought a rhythm that was both exhausting and grounding, a cycle of care, vigilance, and fleeting moments of relief that forced Amy and Chris to become hyper-aware of every breath, every subtle movement, and every tiny change in their child's condition. And yet within that vigilance, there emerged a new awareness of resilience, both in their child and in themselves, a sense that even under the heaviest weight of uncertainty, their capacity to endure, to adapt, and to care could expand beyond what they ever imagined, stretching the boundaries of fear and hope until they merged into something powerful and sustaining. Amy found herself reflecting constantly on the journey that had brought them here, the long, challenging path of weight loss, the surgeries, the public scrutiny, the personal transformations, and the relentless fight to reclaim her health and independence, all of which had shaped her into a person capable of standing firm in the face of extreme uncertainty. And she realized with a quiet, almost staggering clarity that the same determination that had carried her through physical challenges was now sustaining her emotionally and spiritually. Chris, observing her, felt a surge of pride and protective instinct, understanding that their combined strength, his steadiness and her tenacity, created a force that could anchor the family even amidst relentless stress, and together they created a routine of small victories, meticulously preparing meals that supported healing, tracking progress with exacting attention, reading to their child in soft, soothing tones, celebrating each increment of growth with quiet acknowledgement, and even allowing themselves brief reprieves of laughter and lightness that reminded them that joy could coexist with fear. Visitors were rare, but when Tammy and other family members arrived, they brought both support and a measure of normalcy, helping to remind Amy and Chris that while the hospital walls were temporary, the bonds of family were enduring, capable of sustaining them through every setback and triumph. Even outside pressures, like fan speculation, social media comments, and the endless curiosity of the public, faded in importance compared to the immediacy of care, attention, and love concentrated in that single hospital room, where every movement and every sigh carried significance, and where every milestone, no matter how small, was celebrated as a triumph of human endurance and familial devotion. Slowly, but surely, patterns of improvement became more apparent. Longer stretches of alertness, more responsive interaction, steadier vitals, and subtle signs of strength that convinced Amy and Chris, if only cautiously, that the worst had passed, or at least that their child's ability to fight was remarkable and growing with each passing hour. Nights remained tense, but they also became a space for reflection and planning, where whispered hopes for birthdays, holidays, and simple future adventures could coexist with strategies for recovery, therapy, and ongoing care, creating a delicate balance of realism and aspiration that fortified the family for the days ahead. And in these long stretches of quiet, shared presence, hands intertwined, whispers exchanged, tears wiped away, and hearts beating in unison, Amy and Chris recognized the profound truth of their journey. Survival was not only about endurance or medical intervention or external validation, it was about unwavering love, commitment to each other, and the understanding that even amidst uncertainty, hope could be cultivated, joy could be reclaimed, and life could continue to unfold in ways that were both fragile and extraordinary, proving that the human spirit, when bolstered by family, faith, and determination, could withstand even the most grueling trials and emerge stronger, more resilient, and deeply transformed. As the days turned into weeks, Amy and Chris began noticing a rhythm in the hospital that, while exhausting, offered a strange sense of stability amidst the uncertainty, and in that rhythm, small victories began to compound into moments that were not only encouraging but transformative in the way they reshaped the family's understanding of resilience, patience, and hope. Every subtle improvement, a stronger grip of tiny fingers, a faint smile, a brief moment of alertness, a deeper, more regular breath, became a reminder that life could prevail even when circumstances seemed unbearably precarious, and that the emotional stamina required to nurture, protect, and encourage their child was just as vital as any medical intervention. Amy, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here, recognized that her own transformation over the years, through weight loss, surgery, public scrutiny, and the fight to reclaim her autonomy, had prepared her in ways she had never imagined, equipping her with the emotional fortitude to withstand fear, uncertainty, and the relentless pressure of responsibility. And she drew strength from that awareness each time doubt crept in, reminding herself that she had faced impossible challenges before and had emerged stronger, capable of weathering the storm once more. Chris, standing quietly at her side, offered support through action and presence, sometimes saying little, sometimes offering humor to ease tension, but always remaining the steady anchor in a world that felt chaotic and unpredictable, proving that strength was not just physical but emotional, a consistent force that sustained not only the patient but everyone who loved and depended on him. And determination could withstand even the most grueling trials and emerge stronger, more resilient, and deeply transformed. As the days turned into weeks, Amy and Chris began noticing a rhythm in the hospital that, while exhausting, offered a strange sense of stability amidst the uncertainty, And in that rhythm, small victories began to compound into moments that were not only encouraging but transformative in the way they reshaped the family's understanding of resilience, patience, and hope. Every subtle improvement, a stronger grip of tiny fingers, a faint smile, a brief moment of alertness, a deeper, more regular breath, became a reminder that life could prevail even when circumstances seemed unbearably precarious, and that the emotional stamina required to nurture, protect, and encourage their child was just as vital as any medical intervention. Amy, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here, recognized that her own transformation over the years, through weight loss, surgery, public scrutiny, and the fight to reclaim her autonomy, had prepared her in ways she had never imagined, equipping her with the emotional fortitude to withstand fear, uncertainty, and the relentless pressure of responsibility. And she drew strength from that awareness each time doubt crept in, reminding herself that she had faced impossible challenges before and had emerged stronger, capable of weathering the storm once more. Chris, standing quietly at her side, offered support through action and presence, sometimes saying little, sometimes offering humor to ease tension, but always remaining the steady anchor in a world that felt chaotic and unpredictable, proving that strength was not just physical but emotional, a consistent force that sustained not only the patient but everyone who loved and depended on him. A commitment that transformed fear into determination, worry into action, and uncertainty into a quietly growing faith that, no matter the obstacles ahead, their family could face them together, stronger, wiser, and deeply united in ways that would carry them far beyond the walls of the hospital and into a life renewed by hope, love, and the hard-earned knowledge that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit has the capacity to endure, adapt, and ultimately thrive.